I cried at my brother after our parents abandoned us. But he chose them and blocked me. Years later, he called me asking for help. And I had to decide. I'm 33 years old. And sitting down to write this feels like opening an old box full of memories that I would rather not look at. My brother, 7 years younger than me, was like a son to me for a large part of our lives. Although it wasn't something I chose. It was one of those things that simply happened because there was no one else to do it. When I was 14 and he was barely 7, our parents left us in the care of some uncles we barely knew. That decision, so casual for them, was an earthquake for us. They didn't call it abandonment. Of course. My mom, always with her ability to sweeten the bitter, described it as a temporary pause while they put their lives in order. But I understood even then that there was nothing temporary about it. They had tired of being our parents. Our uncles were not bad people. But they were not prepared to receive us. They were older, without children of their own, and had been used to a quiet life for years. Suddenly, they had to take care of 2 children with broken hearts and a mountain of questions they didn't know how to answer. They did what they could. But it was clear that they saw us more as a responsibility than as family. At that stage, my brother didn't understand much. He was a sweet child, full of energy. But he didn't understand why Mom and Dad were no longer there. Every night he asked me the same question, when are they coming back? And every night, I gave him the same answer, soon. I lied because I didn't know what else to say. I lied because the truth was too cruel. The first months were a disaster. My brother refused to eat, sometimes cried over small things, and had nightmares. I, despite being just a teenager, found myself juggling my own emotions and trying to be his rock. I became the person who woke him up to go to school, who helped him with his homework, and who taught him to ride a bicycle. It was like being a mom at 14. Meanwhile, our parents were several states away, building what they described as a new beginning. They rarely called. And when they did, the conversations were short and full of excuses. We're very busy with work, or this is difficult for us too. Difficult for them. I can't count how many times I bit my tongue to not scream at them over the phone. One day, a few months after they left, my mom called and said something that marked a before and after in my relationship with them. She told me, "You should be grateful. We're doing this so you have a better future." At that moment, I understood that they were not coming back. There was no better future for us with them because we were not part of that future. Over time, my brother and I developed a routine. I kept going to school, although I could barely concentrate. He, on the other hand, began to adapt a little. He made some friends in the neighborhood and gradually stopped asking about Mom and Dad. At least he stopped asking me out loud. But at night, when he thought I was already asleep, I heard him crying softly in his bed. Those moments broke my heart. But I didn't know how to comfort him. As the years passed, my role as an older sister transformed into something much bigger. When I turned 16, I got a part-time job to help cover some expenses at home. My uncles were good people, but their financial situation was not the best. Every dollar I earned was used for things like school supplies, new clothes for my brother, or even a small birthday gift to make him smile. I didn't care. Seeing him happy, even for a while, made everything worthwhile. By then, my parents were practically ghosts in our lives. The calls were sporadic, and the visits were non-existent. The last time we saw them was during the Christmas holidays when I was 17. They came with gifts wrapped in shiny paper as if that could make up for years of absence. My brother, who was then 10, was excited to see them, but I could barely look them in the face. To me, they were strangers who came with fake smiles and empty promises. That Christmas was the last time I tried to get close to them. My mom took me aside and said something like, "You know, we're thinking of coming back someday, but we need you to understand that what we did was necessary." It was the last straw. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. But in my mind, I closed that door forever. If they ever came back, it wouldn't be for us. It would be for them. At 18, I left my uncle's house and moved into a small apartment while I worked and studied. My brother stayed with them, but I continued visiting him every week, helping him with his homework, and making sure he didn't lack anything. Despite everything, I had a special connection with him. He was my responsibility, my world. Even when he began to grow and become more independent, I still felt like his protector. Don't misunderstand me. There were moments when I felt resentful. There were nights when I wondered why I had to carry all of this. But in the end, I always came back to the same conclusion: I wasn't doing it for me. I was doing it for him. He wasn't to blame for any of this. And the only thing I wanted was for him to have a chance to be happy. The years passed. And somehow my brother and I managed to create a life that worked. It wasn't perfect. But at least we were together. When I turned 23, I had already graduated from college and gotten a decent job. I continued visiting him regularly, helping him with anything he needed. And although there were nights when I struggled to maintain the balance between my life and my responsibility towards him, I always told myself that it would all be worth it. By then, he was 16 years old and was in that complicated stage of adolescence where everything seems like a challenge. We weren't rich, nor did we live in the best part of the city, but I did everything possible to make sure he had opportunities. I bought him a computer for school, helped him study for his exams, and although my days were exhausting, I felt proud every time I saw him progress. It was around that time when messages from our parents started to appear again. After years of almost total silence, they began to send emails, then occasional calls, always loaded with that strange mixture of guilt and justification. They would say things like, "We know we weren't the best parents, but we want to make things right." At first, I ignored their attempts at contact. I didn't owe them anything, and if they wanted to come back, they would have to earn the right. But my brother didn't see things the same way. For him, the possibility of having our parents back was like a dream come true. I remember a particularly difficult night in which he confessed to me through tears that he missed them. It was like being slapped in the face. How could he miss the people who had left us behind so easily? Didn't he see everything that I had done for him during all those years? But I didn't say anything. Instead, I hugged him and assured him that everything would be okay. Soon, our parents moved back to the city, announcing that they wanted to rebuild our relationship. They didn't do it with humility or with true remorse, but with that arrogance that had always characterized them. As if they expected everything to go back to normal with a couple of nice words. "We've changed," they said. "We want to be here for you." I, of course, didn't believe them for a second. Too much time had passed picking up the pieces of their abandonment to simply welcome them. But my brother was willing to try. At first, he seemed cautious. But little by little he started spending more time with them. They would go to lunch together on weekends. They would invite him to dinner. They even showed up at his basketball games, something they had never done when we were kids. At first, I thought it was something temporary. I was sure that eventually, my brother would realize who they really were. But over time I began to realize that something was changing between us. He no longer called me to ask for help with his homework or to tell me how his day had been. When I tried to plan something with him, he was always busy. "I'm sorry. I'm having dinner with Mom and Dad, or this weekend I can't." They invited me on a short trip. Every time I heard that, I felt a mixture of anger and sadness. I didn't want to compete for his attention, but I couldn't help but feel like I was losing him. It wasn't just that he was spending more time with them, but he seemed to be drifting away from me. The conversations that used to flow so easily were now full of awkward silences and monosyllabic answers. The breaking point came at his high school graduation. I had been saving up to buy him a special gift. A watch that I knew he loved. I had planned to give it to him after the ceremony. But when the moment came, I was met with a scene I didn't expect. There he was, posing for pictures with our parents, hugging them as if nothing had happened. He greeted me quickly from afar, but he made no effort to come closer. Later, when I finally managed to talk to him, he told me something I will never forget. "They are trying to fix things. Why can't you do the same? You can't keep holding on to resentment." I tried to explain to him how hard it had been for me, how much they had hurt me, but he always found an excuse or told me I was exaggerating. Eventually, he stopped answering my messages. Then, one day, I discovered that he had blocked me on social media. It was as if he had decided to erase me from his life completely. I didn't understand how we had reached that point. I had dedicated my whole life to taking care of him, to making sure he didn't lack anything. And now it seemed like all of that meant nothing. I felt betrayed. As if I had lost the only person I had fought for so many years. Years had passed since the last time I heard from my brother. I was 33 years old at the time, and he was 26. At that point, I had accepted that our relationship probably wouldn't have a happy ending. I had convinced myself that I had done everything possible for him, that I had been a good sister, and that if he had decided to walk away, there was nothing more I could do. I was working on a project when my phone rang one Saturday afternoon. At first, I ignored the call. It was an unknown number, and I wasn't in the mood to deal with salespeople or surveys. But it insisted. Once, twice, 3 times. Finally, I sighed and answered, ready to tell whoever it was that I didn't have time. But it wasn't an unknown voice that I heard. It was my brother's. "Hello," he said, with a nervous tone that I barely recognized. At first, I didn't say anything. So many years had passed that my brain took a while to process that it was him. Finally, I answered, trying to keep calm. "What do you need?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then he spoke quickly as if he were afraid I would hang up before he could explain. He told me that things with our parents had gone from bad to worse. After he had let them back into his life, they had shown their true colors again: broken promises, emotional manipulation, and finally, economic demands. According to him, they had been pressuring him to lend them money that he didn't have, and when he refused, they started making him feel like he was ungrateful. I didn't know how to react. Part of me wanted to yell at him, "I told you so. This is exactly what was going to happen," but another part of me, the part that still loved him, was genuinely worried about him. So, instead of scolding him, I simply asked, "Why are you calling me now?" His answer surprised me, because I don't know who else to turn to. Those words hit me like a ton of bricks. I had spent so much time trying to convince myself that I didn't need my brother. That hearing him still see me as an option, even if it was his last option, stirred something inside of me. "What exactly happened?" I asked, trying to understand. He began to tell me how things had escalated with our parents. At first, everything had been perfect: family dinners, trips, even help paying for some of his studies. But little by little, their demands began to be more evident. They asked him to accompany them to events, to speak well of them with his friends and acquaintances, and to act as if they had been exemplary parents all his life. At first, my brother agreed, thinking it was a way to keep the peace. But over time, their demands began to cross a line. They asked him for money to help with an investment that was supposedly going to benefit the whole family. When he explained that he couldn't afford it, they began to emotionally blackmail him, making him feel guilty, saying things like, "You don't care that we're in trouble, after everything we've done for you." That last phrase was the last straw for him. He had spent so much time convinced that they had changed that hearing those words made him realize that he was repeating the cycle we had lived as children. "Now I realize how blind I was," he confessed. "I should have listened to you from the beginning. I didn't know what to say." For years, I had dreamed of this moment, of hearing that he realized that I hadn't been the enemy, but the only person who had really been there for him. But now that I had it in front of me, it didn't feel like a victory. I felt tired, as if I had carried this struggle for too long. I asked him if he had tried to cut off contact with them. He told me that he had, but that it wasn't that easy. Our parents were persistent, showing up at his house and at his job, calling his friends, and even talking to his boss. They were willing to do anything to get what they wanted, and he didn't know how to face them. "And what do you expect me to do?" I asked, trying to sound neutral. I didn't want to commit to anything without knowing exactly what I was getting into. There was another pause. Then, with an almost broken voice, he said, "I don't know. I just need someone who understands me, someone who is on my side." Those words hit me hard. For years, I had felt that my brother had betrayed me by choosing our parents over me. But now, hearing the fear and despair in his voice, I realized that deep down, he was still the little boy I had tried to protect for so many years. I told him that I needed time to think. I wasn't sure if I could get involved in his life again after everything that had happened. But I also knew that I couldn't ignore him completely. He was my brother. And even though our relationship was broken, there was still a part of me that wanted to help him. After hanging up, I stared at the phone for a long time. All of this was too much. Too fast. I didn't know if I could trust him again. If I could open that door without getting hurt again. But something inside me told me that I should at least try. After hanging up, I spent hours pacing back and forth in my apartment. Part of me wanted to help him. After all, how could I ignore his plea for help after everything we had been through together? But the other, more rational part, told me that it wasn't my responsibility. I had done everything possible for him in the past. And he had rejected me. Why did I have to carry his problems again now? The emotions that I had buried for years began to come to the surface. I felt angry. Not only with him but also with myself. I had spent so much time trying to be strong, to move on. But there I was again, caught in the same cycle of sacrifice and pain. That night, I sat down with a cup of tea and tried to organize my thoughts. What did he expect from me? It didn't seem like he was asking for money, which was a relief. But he clearly needed emotional support. I knew he had no one else to trust. However, I worried that by opening that door, I was exposing myself to more pain. The next day, I decided to call him to talk more in depth. I listened to him for almost an hour as he told me everything that had happened. There were details that he hadn't mentioned before, like how our parents had used their social circle to shame him when he refused to help them. They had even gone so far as to show up at his job pretending that they were a united family just to manipulate his colleagues and pressure him. As I listened to him, I realized that he was dealing with something bigger than I had imagined. He was not only facing our parents, but also the guilt and shame that came with acknowledging that he had made a mistake by letting them into his life. It reminded me of myself when I was 14, when I realized that I couldn't count on them. But the difference was that he didn't have the experience that I had. He hadn't learned to close that door because he had never really closed it. When he finished talking, he asked me something that left me speechless: if he could stay at my apartment for a while. He had nowhere to go. He wanted to cut off contact with them completely, but he couldn't do it while he lived in the same place. Our parents knew where he was and didn't stop harassing him. It would only be for a few weeks until I can find something more permanent, he told me with a tone that mixed hope and fear. My first instinct was to say no. The idea of having him in my personal space after so much time apart made me nervous. But at the same time, I knew that I couldn't leave him on the street. No matter how much pain he had caused me in the past, he was still my brother. I asked him for a day to think about it and hung up. That night, I called my best friend to vent. She knew the whole story of our family, and she listened to me patiently while I told her what was happening. When I finished, she said something that stuck with me: you have the right to protect yourself. But you also have the right to decide if this is an opportunity to rebuild something with him. There's no right answer. Do what you feel is best for you. I spent the night thinking about her words. I knew that there were risks in letting him back into my life again. But I also knew that this could be my only chance to get my brother back. After all, he was asking for help. Something he had never done before. How could I ignore that? The next morning, I called him and told him that he could stay with me under some conditions. He would have to commit to seeking professional help to process everything that was happening. He would also have to respect my space and help with expenses while he was there. He agreed without hesitation, which surprised me. It was clear that he was desperate. When he arrived at my apartment that afternoon, I couldn't help but feel a mixture of emotions. On the one hand, I was happy to see him, to have the opportunity to fix things. But on the other, I was terrified that all of this was a mistake. The first week was difficult. Although we tried to act as if nothing had happened, there was a constant tension in the air. He spent most of his time in his room looking for work and trying to organize his life. I, for my part, tried to focus on my work and avoid thinking too much about the situation. One day, while we were having dinner together, he told me something that surprised me. I know I let you down. I know I can't change the past. But I want to try. I want to show you that I'm not the same person who chose mom and dad over you. Those words, although simple, meant a lot to me. For the first time in years, I felt like we were beginning to heal. It wasn't going to be easy, and I knew that there would be days when I would want to give up. But at that moment, I decided to give him a chance. However, what I didn't know was that this would only be the beginning of a much bigger battle. The first week that my brother spent in my apartment was strange. full of awkward silences and half-finished conversations. It seemed like we were both feeling our way, trying to understand if we could really rebuild something of what we had lost. I had my doubts. And although he tried to be grateful and respectful, I knew that there would be difficult times. One of those nights, while we were sitting on the sofa watching a movie, he turned to me suddenly and said, "I can't stop thinking about everything I did to you. I'm so sorry." His voice broke at the end of the sentence. And for a moment I thought he was going to cry. I took a deep breath and decided to be honest with him. "It's not just what you did. It's what it represented. For years, I felt like you were the only person worth fighting for. And when you chose them over me, it was like all my effort had meant nothing." He lowered his head, unable to look me in the eyes. "I wasn't thinking about you. And that's the worst part. I thought that they had changed, that they finally wanted to be our parents. But I was wrong. I was an idiot." I didn't respond immediately. There was something cathartic about hearing those words. But it also hurt me to relive everything that we had gone through. "Why now?" I finally asked. "Why did you decide to come to me after all this time?" It took him a few seconds to answer, as if he were choosing his words carefully. "Because when everything fell apart, I realized that it was always you who was there for me. And I realized it too late." After that conversation, something changed between us. It wasn't as if all the pain of the past had disappeared, but at least there was an open door for reconciliation. However, it wasn't long before our parents reappeared. It all started with a text message that my brother received one morning. It was from our mother, and it said something like, "We know you're at your sister's house. We just want to talk. Clear things up. Please, give us a chance." He showed me the message, and although I could see the doubt in his eyes, I made it clear what my position was. "If you let them into your life again, don't count on me. Not this time." I didn't know if my ultimatum was fair, but I was tired. I had dedicated too many years to picking up the pieces that they had left behind, and I wasn't willing to go through that again. My brother, to my surprise, made the decision to ignore the message. "You're right," he told me. "I can't keep letting them do this." For a while, it seemed like things were improving. He started going to therapy as we had agreed, and he got a new job. I, for my part, was trying to open myself little by little to the idea that we could have a closer relationship. But our parents weren't going to give up so easily. One afternoon, while I was at work, I received a call from my landlord. He informed me that someone had been hanging around the building and asking about me and my brother. I immediately knew who they were. I called my brother, and when he answered, he sounded anxious. "Mom and Dad were here," he told me. "They want to talk. They say it's urgent." My response was immediate. "Don't talk to them. Don't let them in. I'll call the police if necessary." That night, we discussed it. He was divided. Part of him wanted to move on and cut off contact, but another part still had that childish hope that our parents could change. Finally, I told him something that I think he needed to hear. "You can't heal if you keep opening the wound. They are not going to change. And every time you let them in, you're choosing to repeat the same pain." My words impacted him. He didn't say anything at that moment, but the next day he informed me that he had blocked their numbers and decided to cut off contact completely. It was a small triumph, but I knew that the real work was just beginning. In the following months, our relationship continued to improve. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments when the resentments of the past reared their heads. But little by little we began to build something new. My brother even began to open up more about what had happened while he was around our parents, confessing that they often made him feel like he had to choose between them and me. "They were always telling me that you were too harsh, that you didn't understand that they had changed," he told me one night. "But now I see that they were just trying to manipulate me. You were always the only constant in my life. And it took me too long to realize that." Those words, although late, meant a lot to me. They helped me see that although we had lost so many years, there was still hope for us. However, I knew that we couldn't ignore the impact that our parents had had on our lives. We both began to attend therapy, and that helped us better understand our own traumas and how they had shaped our decisions. Some years have passed since then, and although our parents are still a complicated issue, we have managed to find some kind of peace. My brother now lives on his own, and we stay in regular contact. We are no longer the same version of ourselves that we were when we were children. But I think that somehow that's a good thing. We have grown. We have learned. And although our scars are still there, we are finding ways to move on. I don't know if I will ever be able to completely forgive our parents. But at least I have found some closure with my brother. And for me, that's enough.